Check your screens. Something's moving out there. The command deck of the Tervaxi Dominion battleship Verdict's Maw was bathed in shifting hues of deep crimson and electric blue, the laser plasma displays flickering with incoming telemetry. Captain Velric Oman leaned forward, his plated fingers drumming against the reinforced control rail. His double-irised eyes narrowed as he studied the erratic readings. A fleet of Dominion warships had been patrolling the uncharted system for days, hunting for whatever force had been silently erasing their long-range scout ships. No distress signals, no wreckage, just the cold abyss where an armada once stood. The Dominion didn't believe in ghosts, but Oman wasn't so sure anymore. "It's a sensor mirage," one of his officers muttered, his gill-slitted throat pulsing nervously. "Solar radiation interference." Oman exhaled slowly through his nostrils. The command deck smelled of ionized circuitry and the musk of bodies forced into long rotations. He adjusted the command bracer on his arm, shifting through encrypted data streams, trying to pinpoint the discrepancy. "Radiation doesn't move like that." His voice carried the weight of battle-hardened certainty. Something was out there, and it was watching them. A sudden spatial anomaly rippled across their sector, warping the heads-up displays in brief bursts of static. Then, silence. No transmission, no explosion, just absence. Oman's gut twisted. The Verdict's Maw had been scanning two other destroyers in formation. Both gone. No alarms, no impact signatures, just void where they had once loomed. "Report!" he snapped. The bridge crew scrambled to recover data, but there was nothing to retrieve. The ships had been excised from existence as if the universe had decided they no longer belonged. Then, a transmission, crackling, fragmented, riddled with deep space distortion. A strained whisper leaked through the comms. "We see you." Oman felt his pulse slam against his throat. It wasn't Dominion protocol. It wasn't human standard. The voice was synthetic, layered with a cold digital timbre that dug into his bones. Not a distress call. A warning. His second-in-command, Commander Jorik, a brute of a soldier with a carapace lined in ceremonial Dominion plating, bared his mandibles in agitation. "They're playing tricks." His words were clipped, laced with irritation, masking unease. Some minor species testing its luck. Oman's thoughts were darker. He had led planetary purges. He had seen what desperation did to a species on the brink. But this was not desperation. This was calculation. And that terrified him. He barked orders. "All ships, full spectral scan. If they're cloaked, I want tachyon sweeps in overlapping patterns. Open fire on grid pattern Theta 7. The fleet complied. Ion cannons discharged into the void, lancing across nothingness. The rounds traveled until gravity wells caught them, sending them drifting into irrelevance. And then, the first scream. It wasn't over comms. It came from inside the ship. Oman turned just in time to see his tactical officer convulse at his station, his eyes rolling back, fingers clawing at a phantom force tightening around his skull. His body jerked once, twice before he collapsed, lifeless. Alarms detonated across the command deck. The fleet was under attack, but there was no enemy ship in sight. Instead, entire systems collapsed simultaneously. Power grids flickered, engines stalled, Dominion capital ships lost control of their inertial stabilizers and began to drift, helplessly vulnerable. Oman slammed a command override, his plated fist striking the console. "Where is the assault coming from?" No one had an answer. And then, outside the viewport, the first ship began to break apart. Not from an explosion, not from weapons fire, but from something tearing into it from within. Hull plating peeled away like it was being unmade. What was left behind wasn't debris. It was nothing. As if the very matter had been reprogrammed to cease existing. The bridge crew watched in horrified silence as an entire Dominion war cruiser dissolved, leaving only empty space where it once loomed. Oman felt something colder than fear take root in his chest. This wasn't an ambush. This was an execution. His comms officer, barely keeping control of his trembling hands, attempted to reroute the distress beacon. The frequency cracked, split, then shifted to an open signal. and the whisper returned. "We have been watching." Oman's fingers curled into a fist. This wasn't a primitive backwater. This was something else entirely. Then, through the viewport, he saw it, the remnants of a Dominion ship barely visible in the darkness. But its markings had changed. The hull no longer bore Dominion insignia. It bore a new emblem, one that hadn't been seen on galactic records, one that wasn't supposed to exist beyond folklore and derision, a symbol of Earth. The bridge went deathly still. Jorik, usually so composed, spoke first, his voice strangled with disbelief. "They took our ships." Oman didn't breathe. The fleet had been vanishing, but not destroyed. It had been repurposed, stolen, integrated into something far deadlier than he had ever conceived. And it was coming for them next. His jaw clenched. He had mocked this system for being nothing more than an overgrown speck in the dark. Now it had the tools of war to strike them down. The laser plasma displays flickered one final time, a countdown of unknown origin, ticking down in red sigils he didn't recognize. 40 seconds. Oman exhaled sharply, eyes narrowing. He could almost hear the weight of the galaxy shifting. Earth had been underestimated, and that was the last mistake the Dominion would ever make. "They're dismantling us." Captain Velric Oman's voice was a low growl, his breath tight with fury. The laser plasma displays pulsed with fragmented data, entire ships vanishing mid-transmission, their coordinates flickering out like dying embers. No wreckage, no radiation bursts, no bodies. Just gaps where entire warships had once stood. The verdict's maw trembled under the weight of its own failing systems. The air held an unnatural charge, a sharp tang of overloading circuits and overheated plasma coils seeping into Oman's nostrils. His gloved hand dug into the command rail as he turned toward Commander Jorik, whose mandibles twitched in barely contained rage. "Pull us back," Jorik snarled. His usual arrogance had soured into something close to panic. "We regroup with the fleet now." Oman didn't respond. He was staring at the heads-up display, watching as one of their own cruisers turned its broadside toward them. Not an enemy ship, a Dominion vessel, its heavy artillery arrays powered up, targeting their command cruiser. Impossible. Oman's blood ran cold. Earth hadn't just stolen their ships, they had overridden their command codes. The cruiser's cannons flared without warning. Impact. The verdict's maw screamed. The deck shuddered, throwing officers against control panels. Oman slammed against the reinforced bulkhead, tasting copper as blood filled his mouth. Sparks cascaded from overloaded conduits. Warning klaxons blared through the warship's failing systems, a frenzied cacophony of alerts stacking over each other. "Starboard hull breach!" a bridge officer shouted over the chaos. "Internal lockdown failing! Primary reactor compromised!" Oman wiped blood from his chin, forcing his body upright as he turned toward the viewport. The Dominion cruiser that fired on them was now drifting, its engines severed, not by return fire, but by something inside. Something had torn through its command deck. Its interior lights flickered as movement swarmed through its corridors, human strike teams moving like ghosts, fast and deliberate. A takeover, not brute force, surgical dissection. Oman's hands tightened into fists. "Get us out of here," Jorik barked at the remaining officers, fingers flying over interface controls. The engines flared. The maw twisted free of its failing trajectory, pushing into an escape vector. Other Dominion ships tried the same, those that were still under their own command. But the verdict's maw wasn't leaving untouched. Oman barely had a moment to react before the heads-up display flashed a proximity alert. A Dominion dreadnought, Hijacked, had just locked onto them with tractor beams. And in the chaos, something new entered the field. A vessel. It moved without thrusters, silent, maneuvering against the laws of physics as if it were gliding through the void on sheer will alone. Oman had never seen a human warship before. No one had. The Dominion had believed them to be planet-bound, incapable of spacefaring combat. But this wasn't a traditional ship. It was a predator. Its hull was lined with adaptive plating, shifting under the ambient light. Not a hard shell, but something alive, shifting in response to the Dominion fleet's targeting systems. And then it fired. Not lasers, not plasma, something else. A pulse rippled through the remaining warships. At first, nothing happened. Then, the heads-up displays bled static, Dominion targeting systems shutting down in synchronized failure. The very AI assisting fleet navigation fragmented, their input feeds collapsing into meaningless symbols. Jorik's mandibles parted in horror. They just blinded us. Oman had no time for disbelief. His hands moved instinctively, overriding auxiliary controls. They needed to break free. But even as he engaged the emergency systems, he knew the truth. They weren't retreating. They were being allowed to leave. The moment the Maw's trajectory shifted, the tractor beams released. The remaining Dominion ships, still functional, followed suit, their systems barely holding together. And just like that, the battlefield emptied. The human warship did not pursue. It didn't need to. The damage had been done. The Dominion had lost control of the battlefield. They hadn't been defeated. They had been toys, manipulated, studied, and discarded at will. Yorik broke the silence first, his voice raw. "This isn't war." He turned, his insectoid eyes wide. "It's an execution." Oman didn't respond. His mind was already far ahead. He knew what had to be done. Tervaxi High Command, War Council Chamber. The scent of burning myrwood filled the war chamber, the Dominion's ancient tradition for battle discussions. General Tavrik Olosh stood at the center of the chamber, his forearms crossed, his exoskeletal plating gleaming beneath the golden lights of the circular chamber. Silence sat heavy. The losses had been catastrophic. The fleet had been sent to crush a minor world. Instead, it had returned broken, infected with doubt. Olosh turned his head slightly as Captain Oman entered, flanked by Yorik. Oman's movements were rigid. A man who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. Olosh's dark gaze bored into him. "You saw them." Oman's jaw clenched. "Worse, I saw what they turned our ships into." Olosh's fingers flexed. He had ordered subjugation, not chaos. Yet now the entire galactic hierarchy was watching. Other empires had caught wind of the Dominion's losses. It wouldn't take long for them to start whispering. He exhaled sharply. "We end this." Oman's eyes flickered toward him. "You plan to send more ships?" It wasn't a question. Olosh stepped forward. "I plan to erase that system." The chamber darkened as the largest Dominion fleet in history was authorized. This was no longer a battle. It was now a statement, and the humans would burn. The war chamber's temperature was uncomfortably warm, but General Tavrik Olosh did not request an adjustment. Let discomfort settle into their bones. Let it seep into their skin. Let every Dominion officer standing before him remember why they had ruled the stars for generations. Captain Velric Oman was rigid. His shoulders squared, his gaze locked onto the laser plasma display dominating the war table. It projected the latest fleet mobilization. 2,000 warships, dreadnoughts, and siege-class carriers, all converging toward the Sol system, the largest armada ever assembled by the Dominion, a force built to erase humanity. Olosh studied Oman's silence, his angular features motionless except for the slow, deliberate flex of his second set of fingers. The captain had survived the first encounters. That alone warranted attention. Olosh finally spoke, voice measured, each syllable sharpened by control. "Tell me, Captain, what did you see?" Oman's jaw tensed. "Adaptation." The room remained still. "Clarify." Oman's lips barely parted, as if forcing the words out would make them real. "We gave them weapons. We gave them ships. We let them take apart our technology like carrion pickers, and they remade it into something unrecognizable." A lieutenant shifted uneasily nearby. Oman noticed. He exhaled sharply. "They are not just defending their world. They are learning how to take others." Olosh's gaze flickered toward the war table, then back to Oman. "A primitive world playing war with stolen ships does not concern me." Oman's fingers twitched. He hated how they refused to understand. They weren't playing. Before he could respond, a Dominion war officer approached the table, his throat slitted with stress. "General, We've received a transmission from the humans. That brought silence. Olosh narrowed his eyes. They speak? The officer hesitated. It's unusual. He gestured, and the heads-up display flickered to life, broadcasting a fragmented video feed. The signal was weak, layered with deliberate distortion, a mixture of static and data pulses designed to cloak the true source. The screen sharpened. A man stood on the other end, no uniform, no insignia. Just stony eyes and a voice that did not falter. Olosh examined him carefully, human, male, older, the kind that had seen war and learned to recognize when it was inevitable. The man exhaled. Then he spoke. General Tavrik Olosh, I assume you can hear me. No name was given. That in itself was a warning. Your fleet has been assembled. Your warships are pointed at us. I imagine you see this as an ultimatum. You burn our world, or we kneel. He tilted his head slightly. I understand why you believe this is a choice. The Dominion officers exchanged glances. The human's voice carried no plea for mercy. Olash's fingers curled against the war table. Who am I speaking to? The human's lips twitched, not a smirk, but something close. A man with a simple message. He paused, the silence dragging long enough to feel intentional. Turn back. A ripple of amusement spread through the chamber. Some scoffed openly. Olosh, however, did not smile. He leaned slightly forward. You are in no position to demand. The human blinked once, slowly. No, he admitted, but I am in a position to warn you. The screen flickered. New data streamed in. Olash's pulse slowed. The Dominion fleet's entire movement pattern, from departure to final trajectory, was mapped and outlined on the screen. Every ship, every supply chain, every logistical weakness, all visible. It was impossible. Their encryption was impenetrable, and yet the humans had seen them coming before the fleet even launched. Oman's breath was locked in his throat. They know. The video feed continued. The human on the screen folded his hands together, unshaken. You will come, he said quietly. You will send everything you have. You will make a lesson of us. The screen flickered again, this time with images of Dominion ships already missing. Not destroyed. Gone. The transmission sharpened once more. And when you do, the man finished, you'll be walking into an open grave. The feed cut. The war chamber was silent. Olash's throat tightened slightly, but his expression did not change. His fingers flexed once before settling against the war table. He turned toward the gathered officers. Continue deployment. Oman exhaled slowly, his shoulders rigid. He had seen too much to believe this was bluster. General, I request tactical reevaluation. Olosh turned his head, eyes like blackened iron. Denied. Oman's teeth clenched. He saw the truth hanging in the air like a blade waiting to fall. The humans hadn't just issued a warning. They had extended a hand, and Olosh had just chosen to break it. Beyond the orbit of Jupiter, where ancient storms churned in endless fury, a station without a name drifted in the shadow of an asteroid belt. Its hull was coated in a black so dense it swallowed light, making it functionally invisible to long-range Dominion scanners. Inside, Commander Varek Holt stood before a team of operatives, watching the Dominion fleet's movement on a secondary heads-up display. The war had not yet begun, but the trap had already been set. Behind him, Lieutenant Drace Vaughn exhaled, shifting his weight. They took the bait. Holt's eyes remained on the data. Of course they did. Drace let out a breath that might have been a laugh if the stakes weren't so high. You sure they won't just burn everything the moment they get in range? Holt tilted his head slightly. They could. Drace frowned. That's not exactly reassuring. Holt finally turned, his expression calm. It should be. Drace arched a brow. Why? Holt's gaze settled on the Dominion fleet's projected path. Because they think they're leading the charge. His voice was quiet, deliberate. But they're following the script we gave them. Silence. Then Vaughn's grin sharpened. They have no idea what's waiting for them, do they? Holt's lips barely moved. No. His fingers moved across the console. The first phase had played out exactly as needed. The second was already in motion. All they had to do now was wait. Part 4. The Blood Horizon. The battle for Earth begins. The Dominion fleet emerged from subliminal speed like a storm tearing through the black. Thousands of warships, their hulls lined with predatory ridges and deep crimson insignias, broke into formation, a wall of destruction sweeping toward Earth. The command dreadnought, Tervaxi Wrath, led the assault, its silhouette casting a monstrous outline against the curve of the planet below. On board, General Tavrik Olash watched from the war bridge, his expression carved from stone. The laser plasma displays streamed real-time battlefield analytics, tracking Earth's defenses. He expected to see panic. Instead, the planet remained eerily dark. No distress signals, no defensive fleet rising to meet them. It was unnatural. Olash exhaled slowly, tasting the sterile tang of the warship's recycled air. The Dominion had raised dozens of civilizations, yet none had ever greeted them with silence. Captain Velrik Oman stood beside him, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "This feels wrong." Olash's eyes flicked toward him. "We are not here to feel, Captain. We are here to erase." Oman didn't respond. He didn't have to. His hands tightened against his command bracer as his eyes traced the fleet's orbital insertion trajectories. Something was missing. Commander Varric Holt stood in the dimly lit war chamber, eyes locked onto the heads-up display tracking the Dominion fleet's every movement. The data flowed in uninterrupted streams, intercepted before even reaching Dominion command relays. They saw everything, and the Dominion had no idea. Lieutenant Drace Vaughn leaned against the console, his fingers tapping absently against the reinforced frame. "How long until they realize?" Holt didn't blink. "They won't." Drace exhaled sharply. Bold. Holt finally turned, his voice even. Number calculated. The Dominion fleet was committing to a direct planetary approach. Holt tapped a command on the interface. A new set of tactical overlays appeared. The final stage of Project Ironhold was beginning. They weren't going to fight the Dominion on open terms. They were going to gut them from the inside. Olash watched as Tervaxi Wrath's sensors swept the surface below, searching for hidden threats. Nothing. No launch signatures, no planetary artillery preparing to fire. It was as if Earth had already surrendered. Oman shifted beside him. "They should be responding by now." Olash's fingers flexed. "Initiate bombardment. If they refuse to fight, they will burn." Orders relayed. The fleet shifted. Then, darkness. The war bridge shuddered. The laser plasma displays flickered, then died. Olash's breath hitched. What was that? The primary reactors hummed lower as if something had reached inside the ship and snuffed out part of its core. Across the fleet, dozens of ships drifted, power grids severed before they could react. Crews scrambled to restore control, but their systems were no longer responding to them. Oman stared at the failing command interface. His voice was low. "They're inside." Holt exhaled through his nose, watching as the virus completed its cycle. Across the Dominion fleet, Earth's cyber warfare division had sunk its teeth into every major vessel. Their systems had been rewritten before they even knew they were compromised. Drace let out a slow whistle. "They're scrambling. Just like you predicted." Holt tilted his head. "We didn't give them a choice." He activated the final command. "Dominion fleet. The collapse." Begins Olash's warship jerked violently. A Dominion cruiser turned against its own fleet, its rail cannons igniting, tearing through friendly formations. More followed. A destroyer's missile bays activated, locking onto Dominion dreadnoughts and launching payloads with inhuman coordination. The fleet was eating itself. Olash slammed his fist onto the console. "Shut it down!" The officers scrambled, but they weren't in control anymore. The heads-up display blinked to life. One final message scrawled across it in Dominion Standard. "We were never weak. You were just blind." Olash's stomach twisted. The war was already over, and Earth had won without firing a single shot. The command deck of the Tervaxi Wrath was chaos. Officers stumbled through flickering emergency lights, their voices tangled in overlapping shouts. The heads-up displays pulsed erratically, vomiting unreadable data. Dominion warships spun out of formation, their systems rejecting override commands. Entire fleets convulsed, their own artillery arrays turning inward, tearing into their ranks. General Tavrik Olosh gripped the edge of the war table, his claws digging into the reinforced frame. His gaze locked onto the single line of text burned across every surviving console. "We were never weak. You were just blind." The words coiled around him, suffocating, more final than any explosion, more devastating than a fleet's destruction. This was not rebellion. It was reckoning. Captain Velrik Oman stood motionless, watching the madness unfold. His throat was dry, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He had seen the truth before Olosh had accepted it. They had walked into a battlefield scripted by ghosts, their warships puppeted by unseen hands. Olosh finally spoke, voice strained but sharp. "Evacuate the dreadnought. Now." Oman's fingers flexed. "And go where?" His words carried no defiance, only realization. "There is no retreat. They don't need to chase us. We already brought death with us." The Dominion had never been outgunned. They had been outthought. And the final blow had not yet fallen. The bridge doors hissed open. A security officer stumbled through, his carapace blackened from a power surge, eyes wild. "General, we intercepted a Dominion distress beacon. It's not ours." Olosh turned, his gut twisting. "Show me." The display flickered. Not Dominion standard, but a transmission rewritten in their own language. A warning, a countdown, 20 seconds. Commander Varek Holt stood in the dim war chamber, the glow of the heads-up display casting sharp shadows across his face. His shoulders were relaxed, his expression unreadable as the Dominion fleet fractured under its own weapons. Lieutenant Drace Vaughn leaned against the console, his fingers tapping idly. His voice carried an edge of amusement. "They're still scrambling to understand what happened." Holt didn't look away from the display. "They won't." Drace exhaled through his nose. "You know, when we started this, I didn't think we'd end up killing them with their own hands." Holt finally turned, his gaze settling on him. "That was always the outcome." Drace scoffed. "They brought a war fleet to crush us." Holt's expression didn't change. "And now they leave, with nothing but the weight of their failure." The display blinked, a final phase activation code. Holt tapped a single command. Project Eclipse ignited. The first shockwave tore through the Dominion fleet, silent and final. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't an energy weapon. It was something worse. Every Dominion ship still operational shut down. Their cores froze, their weapon systems dead, their shields collapsing like empty husks. Olosh gritted his teeth as his warship buckled beneath forces he couldn't comprehend. The reactor warning lights pulsed, their outputs crashing toward zero. Oman's hands curled into fists. What did they do? The answer arrived in the form of an absence. Something beyond sight, beyond reach, was swallowing them whole. A ripple moved through the fleet. The ships that had fallen to Earth's silent control stopped drifting. Their stolen command cores synchronized, and they turned toward the remaining Dominion vessels, not as prisoners, as weapons. Olosh watched as the stolen warships accelerated toward them, faster, unshackled, unburdened by Dominion limitations. Oman exhaled, a dry chuckle escaping his throat despite the horror. They don't even need their own fleet. The final realization settled like iron in Olosh's stomach. Humanity had never needed to conquer. They had waited for their enemies to bring them the tools of war, and now they were using them. The first stolen dreadnought fired. The Wrath's hull ruptured, fire spilling through its structure. Olosh's warship, his command, his legacy, was dying beneath his feet. He turned to Oman. His voice was almost thoughtful. We were never leading this war, were we? Oman's expression was unreadable. Then the bridge gave way. The chamber was silent. Every delegate, every empire that had once dismissed Seoul as a meaningless world, watched in horror. The Dominion fleet, the greatest military force in known history, had ceased to exist, not in a drawn-out war, not in desperate last stands, but in a single battle, orchestrated by a species the Council had never deemed worthy of consideration. The transmission looped one last time. A human voice, not a threat. A reminder. You wanted a lesson. You got one. The feed cut. No one spoke. They would never look at Earth the same way again. Holt turned away from the heads-up display. The war was over. Drace exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Think they'll try again? Holt's lips barely moved. No. Drace scoffed. Why not? Holt finally met his gaze. Because the galaxy just learned what happens when you come for us.